The blood on her scrubs wasn't hers. That was the first thing people noticed. The dark, rust-colored stain spreading across the left shoulder of her uniform, the way her hands moved with a steadiness that didn't match the chaos erupting around her. Alarms screamed from 3 different bays. A crash cart clattered down the corridor. Somewhere behind the curtain in Bay 7, a man was running out of time, and in the middle of all of it, a senior physician pointed at the exit and said, "You're done. Get out of my ER." Nurse Nora Voss didn't move. Not because she was defiant. Not because she was afraid. She didn't move because the patient in front of her still had a hand clamped over a wound that would kill him in 4 minutes if she let go. And she was not the kind of person who let go. "Security!" The doctor's voice cracked across the room. "I want her removed. Now." 2 guards appeared at the edge of the bay. The rest of the staff stood frozen, watching. Some confused, some relieved it wasn't them. A few already deciding which version of this story they'd tell in the break room later. Nora looked up once. Her eyes were flat and steady. "Someone take over compression," she said. "Right side, second intercostal space. If nobody does it in the next 30 seconds, he arrests." Nobody moved. She went back to work. If you're watching this story unfold, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit like and subscribe. Every single one of them helps me keep telling stories like this one. Wharton Regional Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Delwood, a mid-sized city and the kind of place that prided itself on being exactly what it looked like. Functional, orderly, the sort of town where people showed up on time and didn't make waves. The hospital was the largest employer in the county. 312 beds, a level 2 trauma center, a cardiac unit that had won a state quality award 2 years running. It was also, as anyone who worked the overnight shifts could tell you, a place where the hierarchy was everything, and the patients were a distant second concern. Nora Voss had been working there for 14 months. She'd come quietly. No fanfare, no references from flashy teaching hospitals, just a clean license, a calm face at the interview, and answers that were good enough without being impressive enough to threaten anyone. She'd taken the night shifts nobody wanted. She'd learned the rhythms of the place the way you learn a foreign language, by listening before speaking, by watching before acting, by understanding which rules existed to protect people and which ones existed to protect reputations. She was 33 years old. She lived alone in a rented apartment 12 minutes from the hospital. She ran in the mornings before the city woke up, and she cooked on Sundays, and she kept her past exactly where she wanted it. Behind her, unmentioned, folded away like a flag nobody needed to see. The other nurses knew almost nothing about her. What they knew was this: Nora Voss was fast, and she was quiet, and when things went sideways in a room, she was the person you wanted standing next to you. Beyond that, she gave them nothing to work with. No drama. No personal stories at the nurses' station. No photographs on her phone she was willing to share. Kayla Merritt, one of the day shift nurses who'd been at Wharton for 6 years, had once described Nora to a colleague as the kind of person you trust without knowing why. The colleague, a travel nurse named Danny, had thought about that for a second and said, "That's either really comforting or really unsettling." Neither of them had figured out which. The problem started, as most problems at Wharton did, with Dr. Harlan Price. Price was the kind of physician who used the word protocol the way other people used the word Bible, frequently, loudly, and primarily to end conversations he was losing. He was 51, silver-haired, possessed of the particular confidence that grows in men who have been told they are brilliant for long enough that they've stopped questioning it. He ran the ER with the energy of someone who genuinely believed that efficiency and fear were the same thing, and that a well-run department was one where nobody asked questions he hadn't already answered. He had a way of talking to nurses that made the air in the room feel smaller. The first time he'd gone after Nora, it had been a dosage question. She'd flagged a medication order for a pediatric patient. The weight-based calculation was off by a factor she'd caught on double check, the kind of thing that happened in busy ERs, and the kind of thing that, uncaught, caused serious harm. She'd raised it quietly, professionally, the way she'd been trained to raise it. Price had looked at the chart, looked at Nora, and said, "I've been doing this for 22 years. The dosage is correct." "The weight is listed as kilograms," Nora said. "The order is written as if it's pounds." Silence. He'd corrected the order. He hadn't thanked her, hadn't acknowledged she'd caught it, hadn't even looked at her again as he moved to the next patient. But something in his face had shifted, a tightening around the eyes, a recalibration. After that, he watched her the way people watch things they don't understand and have decided in advance not to trust. 3 weeks later, he'd written her up for unauthorized deviation from standard care protocols after she'd adjusted the position of a hypotensive patient before the attending arrived. The patient's blood pressure had stabilized. The write-up stood anyway. The charge nurse at the time, a tired woman named Bernadette, had read the report and shrugged and said, "Pick your battles, hun," which was the closest anyone at Wharton got to advice. Nora had signed the form and filed it away and continued showing up. This was the 4th month of what had become an open, low-grade campaign. Price questioned her assessments in front of staff. He rerouted her patients to other nurses without explanation. Once in front of the entire nursing bay during a shift change briefing, he'd said, not quite looking at her, as if she were too minor to be addressed directly, "If anyone needs a refresher on the difference between clinical instinct and guesswork, I'm happy to arrange it." Several people had looked at the floor. Kayla had looked at Nora. Nora had written down what she was observing in the patient chart and moved on. What Price didn't know, what nobody at Wharton Regional knew, was that Nora Voss had worked in conditions that would have broken him before the first hour. She'd triaged casualties in environments with no power, no backup, and no margin for error. She had made calls that determined whether a person lived or died, not in a clean emergency room with crash carts and residents on standby, but in the kinds of places that didn't appear on official maps. She didn't think about that much anymore. She had come back to civilian life because she'd needed to come back, because there are things a person can carry only so long before they have to set them down and decide what's left underneath. The hospital was supposed to be quiet work, meaningful but contained, the kind of place where her skills could matter without her history following her in through the door. She had not counted on Harlan Price. She had not, in all honesty, counted on a lot of things that happened on the morning of the 14th. It started with a transport. The patient arrived by ambulance at 7:52 a.m. A male, late 50s, presenting with chest pain and confusion, blood pressure dropping on scene. The paramedics rolled him in fast, giving their handoff report in the clipped, efficient language of people who'd seen enough to know when something was moving in the wrong direction. Nora was already at the bay when they brought him through. She took the report. She looked at the man, and something she'd learned to pay attention to, a thing that wasn't quite intuition and wasn't quite training, but some combination of both that lived somewhere between them, went very still inside her. His color was wrong. Not obviously, not the way it would have been obvious to someone looking for it on a checklist, but wrong in the way that his skin held the light differently than it should, the way his fingers had a quality that didn't match the rest of his vital signs. His BP was low, but not critically so. His ECG showed sinus rhythm with some changes that could have been age or artifact or something else entirely. She started running the differential in her head. "Bay 4, the charge nurse on duty, a man named Ellis, called from across the station. "Price is attending." Nora pulled the curtain around the bay and began her assessment. She asked the patient his name. He gave it slowly. "Graves," he said. "Raymond Graves." And she noted the slight delay, the way he had to find the word. She checked his pupils. She asked him to squeeze her fingers. She was 3 minutes into the assessment when Price appeared. "I've got this," he said, not to her but to the room in general, the way he always spoke, as if the air itself needed to acknowledge his authority before he'd proceed. "Patient is Raymond Graves, 58, presenting with chest pain and AMS," Nora said, keeping her voice even, clinical. "BP is 88/60 on arrival. He's showing some signs I think warrant a closer look before I'll read the chart." "I'm concerned about cardiac tamponade," she said. "The JVD, the hypotension, the muffled nurse," he said the word like a period at the end of a sentence. "I'll read. The chart." She stepped back. She watched him scan the numbers. She watched him look at the ECG strip and decide she could see the decision happen. A subtle shift in his posture, that it was straightforward, that the presentation was a run-of-the-mill cardiac event, that he would manage it the way he always managed things, with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully wrong in front of people who could hold him accountable. "We'll treat for ACS," he said. "Push aspirin, start the heparin protocol, get him to cardiology when they have a bed." "Dr. Price." Her voice was quiet, not pleading, not confrontational, just the voice of someone who needed to say one more thing. "His heart sounds are distant, the neck veins are distended, the presentation fits tamponade much more closely than... Are you diagnosing this patient?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Around the bay, 2 residents pretended to be interested in clipboards. Ellis, the charge nurse, found something urgent to attend to at the station. A tech near the door became very focused on the blood pressure cuff she was holding. "I'm raising a concern," Nora said. "You're a nurse," Price said. The way he said it, it wasn't a title, it was a reduction. A boundary being drawn in permanent ink. "Your job is to support the care plan, not second-guess the attending." He turned to the nearest resident. "Ballard, take over the assessment. Get me an EKG and the troponin series." He walked out. The resident, Ballard, a third year who looked like he hadn't slept since the previous administration, gave Nora a look that was caught between sympathy and relief that she was the one this had happened to instead of him. She said nothing. She documented her concerns in the patient's chart, time-stamped, specific clinical language, and she moved to her other patients. She came back every 20 minutes to check on Graves. At the 40-minute mark, she noticed the change. It was subtle at first, a slight increase in distress, a change in the way he was holding his breath, the quality of his confusion deepening from vague to directional. She checked his pressure. It had dropped. She looked at the neck veins. She listened again. She went to the station and called for Price. Ballard found her instead. "He's in a procedure," he said. "What's the issue?" "The patient in Bay 4 is deteriorating. I believe he's developing acute tamponade. He needs an echo now, and if I'm right, he needs a pericardiocentesis." Ballard looked at the chart. He looked at Nora. He was 29 years old and had been in medicine long enough to know he was still learning, and not long enough to know what to do when his learning collided with someone else's certainty. "I'll page him," he said. "Please hurry." She went back to Graves. He was worse. Significantly worse. The kind of worse that had a direction and a speed and a very clear destination. She started repositioning him, talking to him quietly, keeping his vitals moving through her head in a running calculation. She called for the echo machine. The tech who showed up with it was new and slow, and the machine took 4 minutes to get positioned that felt like 40. When the image came up on the screen, it was exactly what she'd thought it was. "Okay," she said softly, not to anyone in particular. "Okay." She hit the call button for the attending on the overhead page. Not Price specifically, any attending available, language that was direct and urgent. She documented the echo findings. She had a pericardiocentesis kit pulled and ready before anyone official arrived. What arrived first was Price. He came in at a pace that communicated irritation rather than urgency, reading the page on his phone as he walked, and the look on his face when he saw Nora standing next to the echo image was not the look of a doctor reassessing a situation. It was the look of a man who had decided in advance what he was going to see. "I called for a pericardiocentesis kit," Nora said. "The echo confirms a fusion with tamponade physiology. He needs drainage." Price looked at the screen. Something moved across his face, a flicker she would have missed if she hadn't been watching specifically for it, and she saw him recognize it. She saw him know she was right, and then she watched him decide what to do with that. "Ellis," he said, turning from the echo, from the image, from the patient. "Get me Dr. Ortega from cardiology, and get this nurse out of this bay." "She's the one who," Ellis started. "Out," Price said. "She's been interfering with this patient's care since he arrived. I want it documented, and I want security here." The room froze. Nora stood very still. Graves, on the bed, made a sound. Not words, not quite, but something with intention in it. Something that a person makes when the body knows what's happening before the mind catches up. "I'm not leaving this patient until someone is at this bedside who can perform the procedure," Nora said. "You don't have the authority to make that decision." "Then make it faster." The words fell between them like something physical. Security arrived. 2 men, both of them visibly uncertain, both of them clearly hoping this would resolve itself before they had to do anything. One of them, a younger guard named Tavares, made eye contact with Nora and then immediately looked away. Price turned to the room. He was using his full height now, his full register of authority, the posture that had worked for 22 years. This nurse has repeatedly violated protocol, has disregarded direct instructions from the attending physician, and has disrupted the care of multiple patients. I'm requesting she be escorted from the department pending a formal review. A beat of terrible silence. Ortega from cardiology appeared in the bay entrance, took in the room in one quick scan, saw the echo image, and went immediately to the bedside. Nora stepped aside without being asked. She gave Ortega the handoff in 12 seconds. Everything he needed, nothing wasted. The compressed language of someone who understood that speed was the point right now. Ortega was already calling for the kit, already gloving up, when he glanced at her. "Good catch," he said quietly. To no one, to everyone, to whatever record existed in this moment. Price said, "Security, please remove her." Tavares touched her elbow. Not hard, almost apologetic. Nora picked up her stethoscope from the bed rail where she'd set it. She looked at Graves, whose color was already fractionally better, whose body was being given what it needed. And she walked out. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall. The sounds of the ER moved around her. The monitors, the voices, the particular percussion of a busy department, the noise of a place that kept moving regardless of what happened to any individual inside it. She breathed in. She breathed out. She walked to the nursing station and sat down and began writing the most thorough incident documentation she had ever written. Time-stamped, clinical, specific. Every assessment finding, every intervention, every instruction given and by whom, every exchange of words, every moment she'd observed, every decision that had been made in Bay 4 from the time Graves arrived to the time she walked out. She was still writing when Ellis appeared beside her and said quietly, "Price filed the removal request. HR's been notified. You're technically off the floor." "I know," she said. "Nora." He paused. He was a decent man, Ellis. Not brave, but decent. "I'm sorry." "Okay." She kept typing. She had 11 minutes before the thing in the ambulance bay changed everything. The call came over the overhead system in the clipped, neutral language that ERs use when they're trying not to cause panic. Incoming trauma, multiple vehicles, high priority. The kind of language that meant the department needed to brace itself. But the second call, the one that came over the secure channel, the one that only reached the charge desk and the attending on duty, that one used different language. That language had a specific word in it, a designation that meant the incoming patient was not just a trauma, but a particular kind of case with a particular kind of complication. Nora heard it because she was still at the charge desk. She understood immediately what it meant. She was standing up before she'd consciously decided to stand. Through the ambulance bay window, she could see them arriving. Not a single ambulance, but two, and behind the second one, pulling hard into the restricted lane, a set of vehicles that were not hospital vehicles. Dark, with a specific kind of antenna configuration on the roof, a specific kind of license plate she recognized from a different chapter of her life. She was at the bay doors when the first team burst through. The patient on the gurney was unconscious. Male, approximately 60, wearing civilian clothes that had been cut away. But the physiological signs, the cut of his fitness, even through whatever was happening to him now, the particular kind of training scar she could see on his left forearm, she registered all of it in under 3 seconds. Around her, the ER staff moved with the controlled urgency of professionals doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. Price, who had materialized from somewhere, was calling orders. Residents scrambled, the crash bay filled with bodies doing important-looking things. Nora stood at the outer edge and watched, and she saw, clearly, with the precision of someone who had watched similar situations play out in places that didn't have clean floors or backup power, what the people in the room were missing. She moved before she could stop herself. "His airway is compromised," she said, pushing through to the bedside. "The jaw positioning is creating obstruction. He needs manual repositioning before the intubation attempt, or you'll be fighting the anatomy." "Get her out," Price started. The lead resident, Ballard, was already mid-attempt on the intubation and already struggling with exactly what Nora had said. The angle wrong, the anatomy uncooperative, the tube not going where it was supposed to go. Nora reached in and repositioned. 2 seconds. The angle opened. Ballard got the tube. The room exhaled. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the monitor reported a rhythm, and the rhythm was one that meant the patient was still in the game, and the organized chaos of advanced trauma care resumed. "I said remove her," Price said, and his voice had a quality in it now that was harder to read. Not just irritation, but something closer to fear. Tavares appeared again. He looked at Nora. She stepped back from the bedside, hands open, making no argument. But the bay doors were opening again, not from the ambulance entrance. From the main corridor entrance, the one that led from the hospital lobby, the one that patients used, and families, and the occasional administrator. The men who came through it were not patients. They were wearing a specific combination of clothing, civilian on the surface, but with the particular bearing that civilian clothing never quite disguised if you knew what you were looking at. 3 of them, moving with a specific kind of economy that didn't belong in a hospital corridor. The one in front was a woman, actually, late 40s, dark hair, the kind of face that had seen enough weather that the lines in it looked earned rather than aged. She moved with her eyes already scanning the room, already processing, the way people do when situational assessment is so deeply trained, it's just how their vision works. Her eyes found the patient first. Then they found Nora. And in the half-second before either of them spoke, something shifted in the air of the room. Not obviously, not in a way the ER staff would have been able to name, but shifted. The woman said very clearly to the room at large, "Nobody else touches that patient." Price turned. "Excuse me, who are you?" "Major Dana Reese," the woman said. Her voice was not loud, but it occupied the room completely. "Army Medical Command, Special Operations Directorate. That patient is under our operational jurisdiction. All personnel stand back and give me a status report." The ER went very quiet. Price's face underwent a rapid sequence of recalibrations. Reese was already moving toward the bed, already running her own assessment, speaking quietly to a second member of her team who was pulling out equipment from a case that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. The team worked with the precision of people who'd done this, exactly this, in environments that made Wharton Regional's crash bay look like a controlled laboratory. Then Reese stopped. She looked up from the patient. She looked directly at Nora. Not the way you look at a stranger, the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see in a place you thought you understood. "Carter," she said. Nora's expression didn't change. "Voss," she said. "It's Voss now." A beat. "Right." Reese's eyes moved to the security guard standing next to Nora, then to Price, then back to Nora, with a look that asked, efficiently, silently, what exactly is happening here? Nora said nothing. Price said, "This nurse has been removed from active duty in this department pending. She needs to be at this bedside," Reese said. "Not a request, not a debate. She is not authorized. I'm authorizing her." Reese's voice had the specific quality of someone who had stopped having conversations and started issuing directives. Right now, in front of witnesses. She held eye contact with Price for exactly long enough. "You can argue about jurisdiction later. Right now your patient has a developing secondary complication, and the person in this room who's going to recognize it fastest is standing 6 feet away from you." The room was completely still. Price's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Nora walked back to the bedside. She picked up her stethoscope. She got to work. She picked up her stethoscope. She got to work. The patient's name, according to the brief Reese handed her in clipped, sparse language, was Hargrove. No first name offered. Rank withheld. What mattered was what Nora could hear through the stethoscope pressed against his chest. A sound that shouldn't have been there. A subtle but unmistakable crackle on the right side that told her the intubation, successful as it had been in getting the airway open, had created a secondary problem in the process. "Pneumothorax," she said, right side, small, but it's there." Reese didn't question it. She turned to her second team member, a compact man with close-cropped hair who moved like someone comfortable in very small spaces, and said, "Sayers, get the kit." Price was still standing at the edge of the bay. He hadn't left. Nora wasn't sure if that was because he couldn't make himself walk away from a patient in his department, or because he genuinely didn't know what to do when the architecture of his authority was rearranged without warning. His arms were crossed. His face had settled into an expression she recognized, the particular blankness that people wore when they were processing something they hadn't been given a script for. Ballard beside him looked mostly relieved, which was honest, at least. Sayers produced a needle decompression kit with the ease of someone who'd done it without a sterile field, in the dark, in worse conditions than this. He held it out to Nora without being asked. She took it. She positioned. She looked once at Reese, not for permission, for confirmation of what she already knew. Reese gave a small nod. The procedure took 90 seconds. The monitor shifted almost immediately. Small adjustment, but real, the kind of change that meant the body had been given one less thing to fight against. Good, Reese said. It came out flat, which from someone like her was probably equivalent to applause. The bay had developed a specific kind of quiet, not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of a room full of people who had stopped talking because something was happening that they understood they were witnessing rather than participating in. The nurses stood back. The residents stayed out of the way. Even Ellis, competent and unflappable Ellis, had positioned himself near the doorway in the way people do when they've recognized they're not the main character in what's unfolding. Price uncrossed his arms. I need to understand who authorized the suspension of normal chain of command in my emergency department, he said. His voice had recovered some of its register, but the authority in it was thinner now, stretched over something less solid than before. Reese didn't look up from the monitor. Talk to the administrator on call. They've been briefed. I'm the attending physician of record, and I'm the senior medical officer for this patient's case understanding operational protocol. She looked at him then, direct, unhurried. I'm not trying to take your department, doctor, but this patient is mine and right now I need your staff to support, not direct. A beat. If you have concerns about the chain of command, put them in writing and I'll respond through official channels. Price's jaw worked. He looked at Nora. Whatever he was going to say, he didn't say it. He left the bay. Nora watched him go and felt nothing dramatic about it. No triumph, no relief. Just the information that there was now one fewer variable between her and the patient. She turned back to Hargrove. His pressure was coming up. His color was marginally better. He was stable in the specific, fragile way that meant stable for now, which was the only kind of stable that meant anything in a trauma bay. Reese moved to stand beside her. They worked in parallel for a moment. Reese reviewing the monitor data, Nora adjusting the IV line position, both of them in the close proximity of people who've shared space under pressure before without needing to narrate it. How long have you been here? Reese asked, quietly, so the question stayed between them. 14 months. A pause. And this is what it looks like? Nora glanced at her. This is what it looks like. Reese didn't say anything else immediately. She looked at the bay around them. The equipment, the staff repositioned near the doorways, the particular quality of an ER that had just been reorganized by outside authority without warning. And her expression shifted briefly into something that wasn't quite readable before it smoothed back out. We're going to need to talk, she said. After, Nora said. After, Reese agreed. The next 2 hours ran the way trauma care runs when it's working. Not smoothly exactly, because trauma care is never smooth, but with a functional momentum that kept moving forward even when individual pieces required improvisation. Hargrove stabilized. The secondary issues were managed. By the time the cardiothoracic surgeon arrived, a compact, serious woman named Kessler, who took one look at the situation and immediately started asking Nora the relevant questions rather than anyone else in the room. The patient was in a position where the prognosis, while serious, was no longer measured in minutes. Kessler pulled Nora aside during a lull and said directly, "The pneumo catch. That was you?" "Yes." "How early?" "Early enough." Kessler nodded, looked at the chart, looked at the monitor, looked back at Nora with the evaluating gaze of someone who was recalculating something. "Okay," she said, and went back to work. The word okay from a cardiothoracic surgeon, Nora knew, covered a lot of territory. She was rechecking Hargrove's vitals when she became aware that the number of people in the outer corridor had increased. Not medical staff. The energy was different. She looked up through the bay window and saw two men in civilian clothes she could identify by their posture and positioning as something other than civilian. A hospital administrator she recognized as the COO, moving quickly toward the department, and behind them, at a distance, a woman in a blazer holding a phone who had the particular look of someone managing information flow in real time. The COO's name was Barton, Marshall Barton. He'd been in the role for 3 years and had the practiced affect of someone who'd learned that looking calm under pressure was the most important skill in his job description, regardless of whether he actually was. He came into the bay with his hands slightly out from his sides, palms visible, which was the administrative version of approaching with hands up. "Major Reese," he said, finding her immediately, "I've just been briefed. I want to assure you that Wharton Regional is fully committed to cooperating with your team." "Good," Reese said. Barton's eyes moved to Nora, and he went through an almost imperceptible recalibration, the kind that happened when someone saw a person where they hadn't expected to see them. "Nurse Voss," he said. His voice was carefully neutral. "I was under the impression—" "Major Reese reinstated my access," Nora said. Barton looked at Reese. "She's the most qualified person in this room for this patient," Reese said. The tone was informational. She wasn't defending the decision. She was reporting a fact. "We'll address the administrative situation after the patient is stable, which is where everyone's attention should be right now." Barton straightened slightly. "Of course," he said. "Of course," and withdrew to the doorway in the way that men do when they're not sure what their role is, but they're certain they should still be present. Nora went back to charting. She was aware, in the low background of her attention, that the geometry of the department had changed. The cluster of people in the corridor, the quieter-than-normal nursing station, the way the staff who'd been present in the bay kept finding reasons to look in her direction without looking directly at her. Something had shifted, and the shift was still in motion, and nobody yet knew exactly where it was going to settle. She kept her head down. She kept working. The complication came from the direction she'd least expected, which was the only honest thing you could say about complications. Graves, the first patient, the tamponade case from Bay 4, the one who'd started all of this before Hargrove's ambulance ever hit the parking lot, was deteriorating again. Ortega had performed the pericardiocentesis. The procedure had gone well. Graves had stabilized and been moved toward the cardiology floor with the trajectory of someone who'd been caught in time and would probably need further intervention, but was, in the immediate sense, past the worst of it. Except that he wasn't. The alert came from the transport team midway through the move, blood pressure dropping again, the numbers moving in the wrong direction. They were between floors, in the elevator corridor where coverage was thinnest, when the patient's condition changed fast. Kayla, who was part of the transport, radioed the desk. Ellis radioed Ortega. Ortega, who was in a procedure, sent a junior resident. Nora heard the radio call from the nursing station. She was the only person in immediate range who understood precisely what was happening, because she was the one who'd seen Graves arrive, and she was the one who'd tracked his presentation from the beginning, and she knew, with the specific clarity of someone who has run this differential before, that the drainage hadn't been complete, and the effusion was reaccumulating, and if nobody acted with targeted speed, he was going to arrest in an elevator corridor. She looked at the bay where Hargrove was monitored, where Reese's team was managing the case, where Kessler was on the phone 20 feet away. She looked at the corridor that led toward the elevators. She moved. The elevator corridor was a 60-second walk, and she did it in 40. Kayla saw her coming, and the expression on her face moved through surprise into something closer to relief. The resident Ortega had sent, a second year named Forsyth, who was good on paper and uncertain in motion, was running a second EKG with the focused intensity of someone doing the right thing at the wrong pace. Graves was conscious, but barely. His eyes found Nora when she came through, and something in his face, the specific animal recognition of a person in crisis identifying someone who knows what they're doing, steadied fractionally. "I remember you," he said. His voice was rough, air-starved. "Don't talk," she said, already assessing, already running the numbers. "You're the one who— Mr. Graves, don't talk." She looked at Forsyth. "The pericardiocentesis relieved the effusion, but it's reaccumulating. He needs to go back up. Now. Call Ortega directly." Not through the desk, directly. And tell him the drainage was incomplete and the patient needs immediate return to the procedure suite. Forsyth looked at the numbers, looked at Graves, looked at Nora with the expression of someone whose training and their gut were having a very fast argument. "Make the call," Nora said. He made the call. They got Graves back up. It took 11 minutes from the corridor to the procedure suite, and all 11 of them mattered. Ortega, who arrived 60 seconds after they did, confirmed the reaccumulation immediately and went straight back to work. Nora stood outside the procedure suite and let her hand stop for a moment. Just a moment. The brief space between one urgent thing and the next where you let the body register what it's been doing. Her hands were steady. They always were. In the doing. It was afterward, in the small pauses, that she felt it. She was turning to go back downstairs when she nearly walked directly into Price. He'd been there. She didn't know for how long. He was standing in the corridor outside the procedure suite with his arms at his sides this time, not crossed, and his face had a different quality than she'd seen before. Something rawer, less armored, the particular expression of a person who has been confronted with information they'd been successfully avoiding. He didn't say anything immediately. Neither did she. "Ortega confirmed your assessment," he said finally. His voice was different. Not softer exactly, but deflated, like something structural had been removed. "I know," she said. "The first call. The tamponade." A pause. "If you hadn't flagged it, someone else would have." He looked at her. "Would they?" She didn't answer that. The silence between them had a texture to it. Not comfortable, not resolved, but honest in the way that silences are when two people have stopped performing for an audience and are just standing in the same uncomfortable truth. "The write-up," he said. "The removal request." He stopped, started again. "I need to understand what I'm looking at here, because the way this morning has gone, I'm starting to think I've been operating with a significant gap in my information." It was the closest thing to an admission she was going to get from him in this corridor, and she understood that. She also understood that a half admission from someone who'd already filed paperwork against her was not the same thing as a correction, and that whatever Harlan Price felt standing outside this procedure suite right now, there were documents in HR with his signature that still said what they said. "There's a patient downstairs," she said, "under Army Medical Command jurisdiction. When that resolves, the administrative situation will resolve too." She held his gaze for a moment. "In the meantime, the removal request is your paperwork. It says what you decided it should say." He opened his mouth, closed it. She walked past him. The thing about hospitals is that they are very bad at secrets. Not because people are indiscreet, though many of them are, but because the physical structure of a hospital, the open bays, the nursing stations, the corridors where different departments intersect, the break room where people go to decompress and end up talking instead, makes information move the way water moves. It finds every crack. By the time Nora returned to the ER, the staff knew something was happening that was bigger than a staffing dispute. They didn't know the specifics yet, but they knew the texture of it. The military personnel in the corridor, the way Barton, the COO, was orbiting the department with his hands slightly out, the absence of Price from the floor, the very specific energy that Reese's team carried when they moved. Kayla caught Nora at the nursing station. "What is happening?" she said, in the tone of a question that had given up being a question. "I can't get into it," Nora said. "The military people. The patient they brought in." Kayla was keeping her voice low. "Are you in trouble?" "I'm not in trouble. Because 2 hours ago, Price filed a removal order, and now you're Kayla." Nora looked at her. "I'm not in trouble, but I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Whatever you've seen today, everything, make sure you can account for it. What time things happened, who said what. If you documented anything, make sure your documentation is complete and accurate and time-stamped." Kayla's expression shifted. She was a smart woman, Kayla. She'd been in nursing long enough to understand when someone was saying more than the literal words. "Is this about more than today?" "I don't know yet," Nora said, which was honest. Kayla nodded, slowly. "Okay," she said. Nora went back to check on Hargrove. He was stable, Reese was at the bedside, running through something on a tablet, and she looked up when Nora came in and said, without preamble, "He's asking for the person who did the chest decompression." "He's conscious?" "In and out, but enough." Reese set the tablet down. He recognized the technique. Nora went to the bedside. Hargrove's eyes were open. Not fully, but present. The particular quality of wakefulness that follows extreme trauma, where the brain is pulling itself back together, one connection at a time. He looked at her for a long moment. "Voss," he said. The name came out rough but deliberate. "Right here," she said. "Where are we?" "Wharton Regional. You're stable. Kessler is your surgeon. You're going to need a procedure, but not today." He processed this. "How bad?" "Bad enough that it mattered how fast it was caught." He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Who caught it?" She didn't answer that directly. "You should sleep," she said. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, the kind that people make when they're too tired for the full thing. "Still doing that," he said. "Doing what?" Not answering the question. She looked at him for a moment. "Get some rest," she said. When she turned from the bedside, Reese was watching her with an expression that was difficult to classify. Not warm, exactly. Reese didn't tend toward warmth as a default register, but something attentive, recalibrating. "How well do you know him?" Nora asked. "Well enough," Reese said. "He's been running an operational medical advisory division for 3 years. Before that, he was field." She paused. "He's the kind of person who doesn't end up in civilian hospitals under normal circumstances." "What are the circumstances?" Reese looked at the corridor beyond the bay window. "That's a conversation for when this floor is not a mixed audience." Nora followed her gaze. Through the window, she could see Barton in conversation with 2 of Reese's people. She could see Ellis at the station, head down, typing with the focused energy of someone documenting carefully. She could see, further down the corridor, a figure she hadn't noticed before. A woman she didn't recognize, standing with the specific stillness of someone who was waiting rather than lost, holding a badge lanyard she hadn't clipped to her lapel. "Who's that?" Nora said. Reese looked. Something in her posture changed almost imperceptibly. "That," she said, "is the part of this conversation I was going to get to." The woman in the corridor looked up. She looked directly at the bay window. She looked directly at Nora, and reached up and clipped the badge to her lapel. Nora had seen enough different kinds of badges in her life to know at 50 feet what category an ID fell into. She could read the color of the lanyard from where she stood. The directional logo on the badge was familiar in the way that things you'd hope to never see again are familiar. She looked at Reese. "You brought them here?" Nora said. Reese's expression didn't change. "We didn't have a choice. I left." "I know you did." "I was done." "I know that too." A pause. "So does she." Reese looked back at the woman in the corridor. "It doesn't change what she's here to ask." The monitor beside Hargrove beeped with a routine rhythm, steady and indifferent, and the ER kept moving around them the way ERs always do. Patients cycling through, staff crossing and recrossing, the ordinary machinery of a hospital that had no idea that the woman in the nurse's scrubs at the center of its worst morning in years was standing at the edge of something she hadn't been prepared to stand at again. Outside the bay window, the woman with the badge took a step forward. Outside the bay window, the woman with the badge took a step forward. Nora didn't move. She kept her eyes on the woman in the corridor, 40s, composed, the kind of composed that didn't come from personality, but from training, from years of operating in rooms where showing anything on your face was a liability. The badge was turned inward now, which meant she'd clipped it as identification rather than display. The color of the lanyard was a specific shade of gray that Nora hadn't seen in 14 months and hadn't missed. "I'm not going back," Nora said. "She's not here to recruit you." Reese paused. "Probably." "Reese. I'm being honest. I don't know exactly what she wants. I know she asked to be notified if you surfaced in a situation that generated this kind of attention." "Surfaced?" Nora turned the word over. "Like I was hiding. Weren't you?" It was a fair question, and they both knew it, which was why Nora didn't answer it. She looked at Hargrove's monitor instead. The steady rhythm, the numbers holding where they needed to hold. He drifted back under, the shallow unconsciousness of serious medication in a battered body, and his face in rest had the quality that faces get when the performance is suspended and what's underneath is just whatever the person actually is. She recognized the face, she realized. Not personally, but the category of face, people who'd been somewhere and come back carrying the weight of what they'd seen in the specific way that weight settles, permanently, into the body. She looked like that too, probably. She'd stopped checking. The woman in the corridor came to the bay doorway. She didn't enter. She stood at the threshold the way someone does when they understand that the space belongs to other people and entry requires something more than physical movement. "Nora Voss," she said. Her voice was even and unhurried. "I'm Colonel Simone Dark. I'm not here to make your morning worse." "It's afternoon," Nora said. Dark looked at her watch. "So it is." She looked back at Nora. "Can we speak?" "I'm on a patient. Major Reese has the patient covered." A beat. 5 minutes. "There's a family consultation room at the end of this corridor." Nora looked at Reese. Reese gave her nothing, which was itself information. Reese always gave something, even if it was small. The absence meant she didn't know how to wait this either. 5 minutes? Nora said. The consultation room was the kind of space hospitals put families in when the news is bad. Neutral colors, chairs arranged to allow for grief without requiring it. A box of tissues on the side table that had been there long enough the top sheet had stiffened at the edges. Darky closed the door and didn't sit. She stood near the window with her arms loose at her sides, posture that communicated she wasn't here to impose. "You know who Hargrove is," Dark said. It wasn't a question. "I know his rank and I know what his physiology suggested about his training background. I don't know his specific operational role. He's the director of the Medical Response Intelligence Division." She said it plainly, no ceremony. "He was in Delwood for a briefing with regional civilian health partners. He's not supposed to be a high-profile visit. No advanced security, deliberately low footprint. His medical history includes a cardiac anomaly that was documented and managed, but the stress of the last 72 hours created conditions his body wasn't prepared for. The anomaly would have made the tamponade presentation atypical," Nora said, "which is why your ER missed it initially." "Your ER," Nora corrected quietly. Dark accepted this without argument. The attending physician on record dismissed 2 separate clinical flags this morning, one before Hargrove arrived, involving another patient, one during Hargrove's care. She looked at Nora steadily. "We have the audio from the bay." Nora went still. "The bay is recorded?" Hargrove's security protocol includes ambient recording during any unplanned medical event. It's standard for his clearance level. The recording began when the first ambulance called in his status. Dark reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and produced a small device. A digital recorder, older model, the kind that people used when they wanted something that wasn't networked. She set it on the table between them. "I've reviewed it. Reese has reviewed it. You may want to know what's on it before the next few hours unfold." Nora looked at the recorder. She looked at Dark. "Why?" "Because what happens next is going to move quickly, and the decisions you make in the next hour are going to determine how you're positioned when it does." Dark's voice was factual, not threatening. "I'm not here to leverage anything. I'm here because Hargrove is one of mine, and you kept him alive, and I think you deserve to know what you're walking into." Nora sat down, not because she was ready to sit, but because her legs had been moving for 6 hours, and this was the first moment the momentum had paused. She felt the chair under her and the fatigue behind her eyes, and the particular ache that settles into your hands after hours of precise physical work. "Play it," she said. The recording was not clean. Ambient sound, equipment noise, the acoustic mess of a working trauma bay. But the voices were clear enough. Price's voice, authoritative and dismissive. Her own voice, controlled and specific. The sounds of equipment, of movement, of the particular tension that a room holds when something is going wrong in slow motion. And then, later, Reese's team arriving, the quality of the room changing, and in the background of all of it, Hargrove's labored breathing improving increment by increment as the interventions took effect. When it finished, Dark pressed stop. The consultation room held its specific hospital quiet. The attending dismissed a tamponade presentation in one patient and missed a pneumothorax in another within the same 4-hour window, Dark said. Both patients survived because of interventions you initiated. She paused. This is the 4th documented complaint against Harlan Price in 22 months. Nora looked up. You pulled his record. When one of my people ends up in an ER, I pull every record in the building. Not defensive, just factual. 3 prior complaints. 2 from nurses, 1 from a resident. Each one closed without formal action. Each one involving a patient who experienced an adverse outcome that a review board later characterized as potentially preventable. She let that settle. He's also the physician who wrote your removal order this morning. I know what he wrote. There's a pattern here, Dark said. Not just today. We believe today is the day the pattern became impossible to ignore. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the small window of the consultation room, she could see a section of the hospital's exterior, the parking structure, the gray midday sky, a pigeon working at something on the concrete ledge with the focused determination of something that had no awareness of the drama happening 3 floors below. What do you need from me? She said. Not a question exactly, more like an inventory. A statement, detailed, documented, time-stamped. Your clinical observations from the moment Graves arrived through the Hargrove intervention. Dark straightened slightly. And I need you to understand that when this statement enters the record, it becomes part of an official inquiry. The Army Medical Command has jurisdictional grounds to initiate an investigation into the quality of care provided to a protected personnel. That investigation will necessarily review everything that happened in this department today, including the removal order, including the prior complaints. Nor absorb this. And Hargrove? He'll be transferred to a military medical facility as soon as Kessler clears him for transport, probably within 48 hours. A pause. He's going to want to speak with you before then. He's been asking. I know, he said something in the bay. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. Dark reached into her pocket again and produced a card. Plain, just a number. This is how you reach me directly. Not through the hospital admin, not through Reese, directly. She set it next to the recorder. What happens next is your decision, but I want you to make it knowing the full picture. Nora looked at the card. She looked at the recorder. She looked at the woman standing across from her who was being honest in the particular way that military people were sometimes honest, precisely, functionally, without the emotional packaging that made honesty feel like a gift rather than a transfer of information. I was done, Nora said quietly. With all of it. The uniform, the operations, the whole machinery. I came here because I needed to do something that mattered without it costing the same price every time. I know, Dark said. 14 months. This place it's been hard, but it's been manageable. And I was building something here, even if nobody saw it. I know that too. And now you're standing in this room telling me that the thing I walked away from followed me here anyway. Dark was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you that the skills you used to walk away from that world are the same skills that kept a man alive today. And that the people who made your mornings here difficult for 14 months did so because they didn't understand what they were looking at. She picked up the recorder, returned it to her pocket. You don't have to go back to anything, but you do have to decide what you want to happen in this building. She left the card on the table and walked out. Nora sat in the consultation room for 4 minutes. Then she picked up the card, put it in her breast pocket, and went back to work. The department had shifted again in her absence. The particular atmospheric change that happens when information circulates through a staff without being formally announced. People knew something. They knew it differently than they'd known it 2 hours ago. The looks she got crossing the nursing station were different in quality. Still uncertain, some of them, but no longer carrying the low-grade dismissal she'd been swimming through for over a year. Something had cracked in the ordinary texture of the place. Ellis met her at the station. He looked like he hadn't blinked recently. 2 things, he said. Go. HR called down. They want a meeting with you at 4, Barton's office. Okay, what's the second thing? Price left the building. He paused. He told Bernadette he had a personal appointment, but he took his coat and he didn't sign out on the board, and Ellis stopped. He's been here for every shift for 6 years. He's never left without signing the board. Nora processed this. Who's covering his patients? Ortega picked up the ER cases. Kessler has Hargrove. He looked at her. What is going on? When I know what I can tell you, I'll tell you, she said. Keep the documentation on all patients tight. Timestamps. Everything. You said that to Kayla, too. I know. He nodded, slowly, the nod of someone who was adding things up without having all the numbers yet. Okay, he said. 4 o'clock. She spent the next 90 minutes doing what she would have done on any other shift. Patient checks, documentation, the ongoing work of an ER that kept generating need regardless of the drama happening around it. A man with a dislocated shoulder who was trying very hard to be stoic. A teenager with a laceration that needed irrigation and probably more stitches than the resident had initially estimated. A woman in her 70s who was presenting with symptoms that 3 different staff members had categorized differently, and none of them, Nora noticed, had actually sat down and talked to her. Nora sat down and talked to her. Her name was Greta. She'd been having intermittent symptoms for 6 weeks that she'd described to 2 different doctors as dizziness, but were, in the course of a 10-minute conversation, revealed to be something more specific. A positional component, a correlation with meals, a description of what the sensation actually felt like that didn't match dizziness at all. Nora flagged it, updated the chart, added a note recommending a specific workup that shifted the differential considerably. It was the kind of thing that happened in the margins of big days, the ordinary work that existed underneath the drama. The thing that had brought her here in the first place. She was documenting Greta's updated notes when Kayla appeared at her elbow. The military people are in the security office, Kayla said, low and careful. I saw them go in with the security director and one of the IT people. A pause. They brought a laptop. Okay, Nora said. They're looking at footage. Kayla watched her face. Nora, what are they going to find? Nora typed the last line of the documentation. The truth, she said. Whatever that looks like in this building, that's what they'll find. Kayla made a sound that was too small to be identified. Then, the resident? Ballard. He's been asking around about you, quietly, like he's trying to fill in gaps. What kind of gaps? Background gaps. She hesitated. Someone told him you came from a military background, one of the older nurses. I don't know how she found out. She found out because Reese's team used my previous name, Nora said. It was in the room. Carter. Nora didn't confirm or deny it. Kayla, to her credit, didn't push. There's something else, Kayla said. She said it with the particular reluctance of someone who's been holding a thing and has finally decided the holding is worse than the telling. The patient from this morning, Graves. He was moved to a room on the 4th floor. I went to check on him during my break. She paused. He asked me who you were, not your name. He already knew your name somehow. He asked what I knew about you. What did you tell him? That you were the best nurse I'd ever worked with and that I didn't know much else. She looked at Nora steadily. He said, and this is verbatim because it was a strange enough thing that I remembered it exactly. He said, someone went to a lot of trouble to keep her here. Nora went still. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep her here, she repeated. That's what he said. Kayla's voice was careful now. I didn't know what that meant. Nora set down her pen. She sat with that for a moment. The particular quality of a sentence that rearranges things, that makes you look back at the previous hours with a different frame. 14 months at Wharton Regional. The quiet hire, the night shifts, the lack of fanfare. The way her application had processed faster than she'd expected. The way the reference she'd listed, a former colleague from a transitional period, someone she'd trusted, had never been someone who should have known anything about civilian hospital hiring. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep her here. She stood up. Where are you going? Kayla asked. To talk to Hargrove. He was awake when she came in. Properly awake this time. The glassy post-sedation quality was mostly gone, replaced by the alert, watchful quality she now recognized as his default state. The room was dim. Kessler had ordered limited stimulation. One of Reese's team members sat in the corner and stood when Nora entered, then sat back down when she gave him a look. Hargrove watched her come to the bedside. You want to know who placed you here, he said. I want to know if I had a choice, she said, about being here. You had a choice. He said it without hesitation. The position was real. The application process was real. Nobody fabricated your credentials or manufactured the offer. He paused, the careful pace of someone measuring their words against their energy. But the position was made available because someone thought it would be beneficial for someone with your specific background to be embedded in a civilian medical environment, the same way we sometimes embed personnel in other institutional contexts. I wasn't embedded. I left. You transitioned, he said. There's a distinction. Not from where I'm standing. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. You saved my life today, he said. It came out without ceremony. Reese's team saved your life. I caught a secondary complication. You caught two things in this building before noon that would have killed two different people. One of them was me. He shifted slightly, careful of the lines. I'm not going to pretend that's not relevant to what I'm about to say. Then say it. The investigation that's opening up? Dark told you? She told me the basics. The basics are that Price is going to have his practice reviewed. The administration is going to have its documentation reviewed, and the pattern of institutional suppression that's been operating in this building for a long time is going to be exposed in a way that it can't be walked back from. He paused. We didn't plan for today to be the trigger, but today happened, and now the review is happening, and what comes out of it is going to depend partially on the documentation that already exists, and partially on the testimony of people who were in the room. You want me to testify? I want you to tell the truth, which I understand you were already doing, even when nobody was listening. His voice was even, unperformative. What I want you to understand is that the testimony of a decorated combat medic with your operational history is going to carry a different weight than the testimony of a nurse with 14 months at a regional hospital. And right now, for the purposes of this investigation, you are both of those people simultaneously. She looked at him for a long moment. You knew, she said, when you were coming in and out of consciousness in the bay. You knew what was happening. I was cognitively impaired, he said, but not entirely. You asked for me specifically, the decompression. Reese told me who'd caught the pneumo. I asked to see you. He met her eyes without flinching. People in my position recognize certain things about other people in similar positions, even in the middle of a medical emergency. She absorbed this. The room was quiet except for the monitor and the distant ambient sounds of a hospital doing its perpetual work. The removal order Price filed, she said. That's still in the system. It'll be addressed. It's in the system right now. Tonight, when this department closes and the administrative staff go home, my file still shows a removal order and a formal complaint. I understand. I'm not asking you to fix it, she said. I'm telling you the situation so it's in the room. He nodded. Noted. He was starting to tire. She could see it in the way he was managing his breathing, the micro adjustments that people make when they're trying to project more energy than they have. There's one more thing, he said. What? The footage. He paused. The security footage from this department. All of it. Not just the bay recording, the corridors, the nursing station, the elevator banks. Dark's team has access to it. Kayla said they were in the security office. Yes, and what they're finding... He stopped. A longer pause. It's more than today. The footage is archived, and the pattern of behavior in this department toward staff, toward patients, toward reporting structures, it goes back further than 14 months. He looked at her directly. It goes back to before you arrived. She understood what that meant. She understood what it meant for the investigation, for the scope of it, for the number of people and decisions it was going to encompass. She understood specifically what it meant for Barton, the COO, who'd managed this department's administration for 3 years and hadn't seen what had been building inside it, or had seen it and made different choices. She was about to ask the question forming in her mind when the door to the room opened. It was dark. Her face had a quality that Nora had not seen on it before. Controlled urgency, the expression of someone moving on a compressed timeline. We have a situation, Dark said. What kind? Hargrove said. Price. She looked at Nora. He came back. He's in the administrator's office with Barton and two people we haven't been able to identify yet. He made a phone call 20 minutes ago to someone in the state medical licensing board. She paused. He's not running. He's building a counter-narrative. Nora felt something go very still inside her. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. He's going to file a complaint, she said, against me, formally through the licensing board, before the investigation gets traction. If the complaint is on record first, it shifts the burden, Dark confirmed, and it creates a timeline where his documentation precedes ours. Can you stop it? I can slow it. Dark looked at her. But I need everything you have. All of it. Your documentation, your incident notes from today, anything you've written down in the last 14 months that touches on patient care decisions you flagged and how they were handled. She paused. And I need it in the next hour. The monitor beeped. Hargrove's hand moved on the bed, not reaching for anything, just the small, involuntary movement of a body registering stress even under sedation. Nora reached into her breast pocket. She pulled out her phone. She'd been documenting on her personal device since the Graves incident. Photographs of her own chart entries, time-stamped, back to a cloud account that existed outside the hospital's system. She'd started doing it after the first write-up, 14 months ago. She held the phone out to Dark. I have everything, she said. Dark took it. She looked at the screen. She looked at the volume of what was there. Months of careful, systematic, unglamorous documentation, everything Nora had observed and flagged and watched be dismissed, all of it preserved in the specific format of someone who had always understood, underneath the 14 months of quiet civilian life, that a day like this one might come. Something moved across Dark's face that was not quite professional. Give me 45 minutes, she said. She was 3 steps toward the door when her radio, not her phone, the tactical radio on her belt, activated with a burst of static and a voice that cut through the room's quiet with the compressed urgency of someone reporting fast. Nora caught 2 words clearly before the transmission broke up. The first was Barton. The second was documents. And then the voice said something that made Darky stop walking, made her turn around, made her look at Nora with an expression that had no category in the professional register she'd been operating from all day. They're shredding files, Dark said. They're shredding files, Dark said. She was already moving when she said it, the tactical radio back at her mouth, her voice dropping into the clipped register of someone shifting from assessment to action. Nora was 2 steps behind her before she'd consciously decided to move, not because anyone had asked her to, but because 14 months of documentation and 6 hours of controlled chaos had built a momentum in her body that wasn't done yet. The corridor outside Hargrove's room was different now. 2 of Reese's people were moving toward the administrative wing at a pace that wasn't running, but wasn't walking either, the specific gait of people covering ground without announcing they were covering it. A hospital security guard near the elevator looked up, tracked them, looked uncertain about what his role was in whatever was happening. Dark was on the radio. Sayers, what's the status? How long has the machine been running? The response came back in fragments. Ambient noise, the unmistakable mechanical sound of a cross-cut shredder working through volume, a voice saying something about the administrative assistant having been sent on an errand. Can you halt it? Dark said. A pause. Then, we'd need grounds. I'm working on grounds. She killed the transmission and looked at Nora without slowing. The military jurisdiction covers Hargrove's records. Anything pertaining to his care, his case, communications relating to his presence in this building. That's ours, and they cannot legally destroy it. She pushed through the stairwell door. But hospital administrative records, HR files, internal complaint documentation, that's civilian institutional property, and my authority to stop the destruction is narrower. Unless the destruction constitutes obstruction, Nora said. Unless that. Dark glanced back at her, which requires a demonstrated nexus to an active investigation. Is there an active investigation? There is, as of 40 minutes ago. Dark's voice was flat. The question is whether Barton's legal team knows that yet. They came out of the stairwell into the administrative corridor on the 3rd floor, a different world from the ER 2 floors below, carpeted and quiet, the kind of institutional space designed to project stability and process. The doors here were mostly closed. The overhead lighting was softer. At the far end, the door to Barton's suite was shut, and Nora could see a light on through the frosted glass panel. Sayers was standing outside it with the posture of someone who was waiting for authorization rather than preventing anything. A second member of Reese's team was positioned near the corridor intersection. Not blocking, not confrontational, but present in a way that said he knew where the exits were. From behind the closed door, the shredder sound was audible. Low, mechanical, continuous. Dark stopped outside the door. She didn't knock immediately. She looked at Nora. "The complaint he's filing through the licensing board," she said, low enough that it stayed between them. "If Price succeeds in entering it before our investigation documentation is formalized, it creates a competing record. Not insurmountable, but it complicates the timeline and gives his attorneys an argument about motivated evidence." She paused. "The files they're destroying may include the prior complaint records against him, the ones that were closed without action. If those are gone, the pattern is harder to establish." She straightened slightly. "Everything depends on what's already preserved outside this building." Nora thought about the 3 nurses and the resident who'd filed those prior complaints. She thought about what it had cost them to file, the calculation every person in a hierarchical institution made before they put their name on something that pushed against authority, and what it would mean if the record of that cost was fed through a machine in the next 4 minutes. She thought about Greta, the 70-year-old woman she'd sat with that afternoon, the 10-minute conversation nobody else had made time for. She thought about what it meant to do the right work when nobody was watching, and what happened to institutions where the right work was systematically punished. Dark knocked. The door opened after a delay that was 3 seconds too long, the specific hesitation of people who needed a moment to arrange what was happening in the room. The woman who opened it was Barton's administrative assistant, whose name was Patel, and whose face was wearing the careful blankness of someone who'd been told to appear normal and was concentrating very hard on it. "Mr. Barton is in a private meeting," Patel said. "I know," Dark said. "I need to interrupt it." "He's asked not to be—" "Ms. Patel." Dark's voice was not unkind, but it was final. "I'm coming in." She moved forward. Patel stepped aside, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative required a physical obstruction she wasn't prepared to make. The outer office opened into Barton's inner suite through a second door that was half open, and through it Nora could see the tableau clearly. Barton behind his desk, his jacket still on despite it being late afternoon, his hands flat on the desk surface in the posture of someone who'd been in the middle of a decision when the knock came. Price to his right, standing, a phone in his hand. And beside the lateral filing cabinet, a man Nora didn't recognize operating a commercial shredder with the systematic focus of someone working through a stack. The unfamiliar man saw Dark and stopped the machine. The room had a specific quality: paper dust in the air, the smell of mechanical heat, the residual static of interrupted momentum. Barton stood. "Major Reese told me there would be consultation before any further military personnel. Colonel Dark," she said, "Army Medical Command, and the consultation period is over." She looked at the shredder, at the man standing beside it, at the remaining stack of documents in the feed tray. "I need those files." "These are internal hospital records," Barton said. "You don't have—" "Stop talking about what I have." Her voice didn't rise, it compressed. There was a difference, and the room felt it. "You are in the middle of destroying documents in a building where a federal medical review has been initiated. That's not an administrative judgment call. That's a decision with legal consequences that you are making right now, in real time, in front of witnesses." Price moved. Not toward the door, toward the desk, a step that put him between Dark and Barton in the geometry of the room, a physical alignment that said something about where the decision-making had been happening. "The files being processed are routine administrative documents," Price said. His voice had recovered its register, the authoritative physician's certainty, the practiced confidence. "Standard records management. Nothing related to any military jurisdiction." "You're filing a licensing complaint against a member of this department's nursing staff while simultaneously destroying HR documentation," Dark said. "You'd like me to treat those as unrelated events. I'd like you to produce the specific authority under which you're claiming access to civilian institutional records." He said it well. Nora had to give him that. He'd gotten far enough ahead of himself to prepare for this specific argument, which meant he'd thought through the scenarios, which meant some part of him had understood since this morning that today was not going to stay contained. Dark reached into her jacket and produced a document. She set it on Barton's desk. Operational Medical Records Preservation Order, issued by JAG, Army Medical Command, 90 minutes ago. Covers all documentation in this facility pertaining to the care, presence, and administrative handling of personnel under military medical jurisdiction. She looked at Price. The nursing staff member you're targeting was the primary responder for the protected personnel. That makes her relevant to the military record. That makes your complaint filing an attempt to create adverse documentation against a material witness in a federal review. The room was very still. Barton looked at the document. He looked at Price. Something moved across his face. A specific recalculation, the expression of a man who had been convinced he was holding a manageable situation and was only now seeing its actual dimensions. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," Barton said. "That's your right," Dark said. "Don't touch those files while you're doing it." She looked at the man beside the shredder who had been standing motionless since the machine stopped. "Step away from the cabinet, please." He did. No argument. The kind of compliance that said he was hired help rather than invested party, and whatever loyalty he'd had to the project evaporated the moment federal authority entered the room. Darky looked at Nora for the first time since they'd entered. Nora looked at the shredder, at the stack of papers still in the feed tray, at the smaller pile of destroyed material in the collection bin below, already processed, already reduced to strips that could not be reconstructed. "How much got through?" she said. "We'll need a document specialist to assess what's destroyed," Dark said, "but the stack in the tray is intact." She paused. Whatever they prioritized destroying was what they were most afraid of, Nora finished. Barton sat back down heavily, the kind of movement a body makes when it stops performing composure. He picked up his desk phone. He started to dial. Price was still standing. His phone was in his hand, and Nora could see from the angle of the screen that he was looking at something on it. A message, a contact, something he'd been checking since they walked in. His face had closed down into a particular expression she recognized not from medicine but from somewhere earlier, from environments where people made rapid assessments of how much risk they were actually carrying and adjusted accordingly. He was afraid. Not in a way that collapsed him. He was not a man who collapsed easily, which had been part of the problem all along. But the fear was there, operating underneath the control, in the slight tension at the jaw and the way his thumb had stopped moving on the phone screen. He looked up and found Nora looking at him. "You did this," he said, quiet enough that it was almost private. "You did this," she said. "I just documented it." The next 2 hours moved in the way that institutional reckonings move, not with the clean speed of a verdict, but with the grinding procedural weight of systems correcting themselves, which is slow and unglamorous and involves a lot of paperwork. Dark's people secured the files in Barton's office. A JAG representative arrived from a field office 40 minutes away and took custody of the shredder's contents for forensic analysis. The document specialist, a woman who arrived in civilian clothes and set up her equipment in the outer office with the methodical focus of someone who'd done this before in less cooperative environments, began working through the intact stacks systematically. Nora was in the corridor outside when Sayers appeared and handed her a bottle of water without comment. She drank half of it before she was aware she was doing it. Kayla found her there 20 minutes later. "Ellis told me you went upstairs," Kayla said. "Are you—" She stopped, read Nora's face, changed the question. "What can I do?" "Go back to the floor," Nora said. "Stay with the patients. Make sure the evening shift is fully briefed on everyone in the census." She paused. "Graves on 4. Check on him before handoff. Make sure his documentation is complete." "Okay." Kayla didn't move immediately. "Price, is he— He's in the building. Because the attendings have been asking. Nobody knows who's covering. Ortega has the ER. Kessler has Hargrove. Call the on-call administrator for anything else." Nora looked at her. "The patients are covered. Go take care of them." Kayla went. The corridor was quiet again. Through the frosted glass of Barton's office suite, Nora could see movement, multiple figures, The back and forth of people managing a situation in the specific way that situations require managing when they've grown larger than anyone planned. She thought about what Hargrove had said. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep her here. She turned it over again, the way you worry at a splinter. The fact of it, the implication of it, the question of how much of her 14 months at Wharton had been chosen and how much had been arranged. She wasn't sure it changed anything. The work she'd done here was real. The patients were real. Whatever the mechanism that had placed her in this building, the 14 months inside it had been hers. She was still working through this when the document specialist came out of the inner office holding a single folder. Not the full stack, just one folder. The kind of targeted retrieval that meant she'd found something specific. Colonel Dark asked me to flag anything with multi-party signatures, the specialist said. Not to Nora, to Sayers, who had reappeared. This one has 6. Sayers took it, looked at the cover page. His expression didn't change, but he moved immediately toward the inner office where Dark was. Nora caught a partial view of the folder's tab before it disappeared through the door. She read, Complaint Resolution, Voss, N, Consolidated File. She stood with that for a moment. Not the complaints Price had filed, a consolidated file, multiple entries, multi-party signatures. Someone had been building a file on her, not just today's removal order. A deliberate, accumulated record, the kind that gets assembled when an institution has decided in advance what it wants to do with a person and is constructing the paper foundation for that decision. She walked to the door and opened it. Dark was reading the folder. When Nora entered, she looked up. She looked at Nora's face. She made a decision. Sit down, she said. I saw the tab. I know. Sit down. Nora sat. Darky set the folder on the desk between them. This was assembled over 11 months. It started 3 months after you arrived. She turned pages, not handing them to Nora yet, reading as she summarized.
6
separate entries. Each one documents a supposed protocol deviation or unauthorized clinical decision. Each one has been reviewed and co-signed by Barton. She looked up. None of them were entered into your official HR file. None of them generated formal write-ups. They were kept separately. A pause. This is not a disciplinary record. This is a pre-termination file, the kind you assemble when you want documentation ready to justify a separation that's already been decided. Nora was quiet. The decision had been made to remove you, Dark said, not for performance. The entries are too thin for that. Anyone reading them clinically would see they don't support the characterizations. She closed the folder. This was about something else. What? Dark looked at her steadily. Price requested your placement in this department. The sentence didn't make sense for a moment. Nora heard it, and her brain tried to fit it against everything she understood about the last 14 months. And it didn't fit, and then it did. Slowly, with the specific, terrible quality of things that fit when you didn't want them to. He requested my placement, she said. His name is on the internal staffing request that preceded your hire. He specified the role, the shift pattern, and he specifically noted a preference for candidates without local professional networks. Dark's voice was careful, factual. We don't yet know the full reasoning, but a nurse without local connections, without an established reputation in this community, without relationships that would make institutional pushback complicated, is easier to control, Nora said, and easier to remove when the time came. Yes. He didn't know about my background. Almost certainly not. Whatever the staffing channel was, the military component of your history was sealed. He would have seen a qualified nurse with a gap in her work history and solid but not exceptional references. Dark paused. Someone made a mistake in the placement chain. They put you in a position with someone who had a pattern of targeting staff he perceived as threats, without understanding what they were placing you next to. Nora sat with this, with the specific quality of understanding that comes when a year's worth of small degradations resolve into a single coherent shape. The write-ups, the public humiliations, the erosion, patient and systematic, of her standing in the department. She had understood it as cruelty, as ego, say, as the ordinary abuse of institutional power. She had not understood it as a project. He was building the file to fire me, she said. Before you could build a file on him, Dark said. Yes. The radiator in Barton's office made a sound, a low, settling sound, the kind of sound old buildings make when the temperature shifts and the metal contracts. Outside the window, Delwood was moving into evening. The sky through the glass had gone from gray to a darker gray, the particular color of the hour before the light goes completely. "How much of this does Barton know?" Nora said. "The co-signatures on the file say he knew about the documentation." Dark turned one page of the folder so Nora could see it. "Whether he understood its full purpose is something the interview will establish." She closed the folder again. "He's with his attorney. The interview will happen tonight or tomorrow morning." She looked at Nora. "You should have a lawyer present too. Not because you're a subject of investigation. You're not. But because your testimony is going to carry significant weight and the process should be properly supported." "I know a lawyer," Nora said. She did. A former colleague's spouse. A woman she'd met twice at social events she didn't particularly enjoy and who had given her a card she'd kept in the bottom of her work bag for the same reason she'd kept everything else. Just in case. "Good." Dark stood. "Tonight, go home. Get some sleep if you can. Your statement is already in process from what you provided earlier. Tomorrow is going to require you to be clear." Nora stood too. She looked at the folder on the desk, the 11 months of manufactured narrative, the assembled architecture of her own professional destruction, built by people who hadn't known what they were actually dealing with. "I want copies of that file," she said. "You'll have them," Dark said. She went back to the floor before she left. Not because anyone needed her to. The evening shift was running. Ortega had the ER in hand. The patients were covered. She went back because she had unfinished documentation on 3 patients, and she was not going to leave it for the night shift to interpret, and because she needed, specifically, to be in the room where she worked for a few minutes before she walked out into the evening. The nursing station was quieter than the morning. Different staff, different energy, the particular rhythms of an evening shift that had been briefed on a complicated situation and was doing what staff does, absorbing it, continuing to function, maintaining the work regardless of the drama around it. Ballard was at the station. He looked up when she came in. "You're still here," he said. "Finishing notes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Graves, room 412. He's been asking for you." "I'll go up." "Nora." He said her name like he hadn't quite planned to. She looked at him. He was 29 and tired, and he had the expression of someone who had gone through a long day and arrived somewhere at the end of it that he hadn't expected to arrive at. "The intubation, this morning, if you hadn't repositioned, you were working with the anatomy you were given," she said. "The positioning changed the anatomy, that's all. I would have gotten it eventually. Probably. But not fast enough." She looked at him, this young doctor who was good on paper and uncertain in motion, who had chosen the right thing this morning when the choice wasn't clean, who had made Ortega's call when she'd asked him to and then stayed out of the way when Reese's team arrived instead of posturing about his authority. "You did fine," she said. Get some rest." She went up to 412. Graves was sitting up, more alert than she'd expected, color better, the specific post-procedural improvement of someone who'd been given back the thing his body had been starved of. He watched her come in with the careful attention of someone who'd been thinking about what he wanted to say. "You went upstairs," he said. "Administrative floor. Word travels. Hospitals." He shifted against the pillow. "I heard they stopped the shredding." "Most of it." "Most?" He processed this. "What was lost?" "We'll know more tomorrow." She pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat. Not the professional proximity of a nurse at a bedside, but the closer, more direct sitting of someone who is done with the performance of the role for the day. "You said something to Kayla about trouble being taken." "I did." "Were you part of it?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the specific quality of honesty that people develop when they've been close enough to their own death, that pretense seems like a waste of the remaining time. "I knew you were here," he said. "I didn't arrange it, but I knew." He met her eyes. "When the briefing was set in Delwood, I had the regional roster pulled. I saw your name. I made no effort to schedule the meeting anywhere else." She absorbed this. "You came here partly to check on me." "Partly." A pause. I also needed the briefing. How reassuring. I'm not going to apologize for it, he said. You're one of the best medical minds I've encountered in field or civilian context. The fact that you were spending it in an ER where nobody understood what they had seemed. He stopped, chose the next word carefully. Wasteful. That wasn't your call. No? He agreed. It wasn't. They sat with that. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. The particular quality of two people who understand each other's positions without needing to resolve the argument between them. There's a file upstairs, she said. Assembled over 11 months. Price built it. Barton co-signed it. Hargrove's expression shifted. Not surprise, which told her he'd had some version of this information already, but something more complex. How extensive? Extensive enough. 6 documented incidents, all of them manufactured or distorted. She looked at him. He requested my placement in this department before I arrived. Hargrove went still. You didn't know that part, she said. No. He said it quietly. I didn't know that part. Someone in whatever placement chain handled my transition made an error. They put me next to someone with a pattern. She kept her voice even. I'd like to understand the full chain of custody on how I ended up at this specific hospital. You'll have it, he said. The same cadence Dark had used. Functional commitment, no ceremony. Tonight, she said. He looked at her. I want the full chain of custody tonight, she said. Before I give a formal statement tomorrow, I need to know the shape of the thing I'm standing in. A long pause. The monitor kept its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, a call light chimed and footsteps moved toward it, and the ordinary work of the building continued indifferent to everything happening in this room. I'll make some calls, Hargrove said. Thank you. She stood. She looked at him one more time. This man who was alive because of a sequence of decisions that had started 14 months ago when she'd taken a job nobody else wanted on a shift, nobody else wanted in a city, nobody from her previous life would have expected to find her in. Rest, she said. She went back to the station and finished her documentation. She logged out of the system at 7:42 p.m. She collected her bag from her locker. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words. Watch the news, Channel 4, right now. She stopped. She looked around the break room. Empty. One overhead light on. The television mounted on the wall tuned to the local news with the sound low. She reached up and turned the volume up. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Exclusive, Wharton Regional Hospital under federal review. Military officer treated. But that wasn't what stopped her. The footage was security camera footage. Exterior, the hospital parking structure, time-stamped from earlier that afternoon. It showed a man in a physician's coat entering a vehicle. The angle was clear. The face was clear. Price. And in the passenger seat, already there when he got in, a second person. The man who'd been operating the shredder in Barton's office, whose name she didn't know, whose presence she'd accepted as hired help. They'd met before Price came back to the building. They'd planned it before Price came back to the building. She looked at the timestamp on the footage. It was from 2 hours before Dark had knocked on Barton's office door, before the shredding had started, before the licensing complaint, before any of the counter-narrative moves that she'd been watching Price build in real time. He hadn't been improvising. She stood in the break room with her jacket half on and her phone in her hand, and the news playing on the wall, and she understood, with the specific clarity of a person who has been trained to see the difference between someone reacting and someone executing a prepared plan, that Harlan Price had known this morning was coming before this morning arrived. Which meant the file on her wasn't a response to today. It wasn't even primarily about today. And the question she didn't yet have the answer to, the question that would determine what tomorrow looked like, was what exactly he'd known was coming and how long ago he'd started preparing for it. Her phone buzzed again. Dark. Come back upstairs. Now. He talked. She was back upstairs in 4 minutes. The administrative corridor had more people in it now. A JAG officer she hadn't seen before. One of Dark's people on a phone call near the window. and a woman in a gray suit who had the specific energy of someone from an oversight body who had been called in and was still calibrating how serious the situation actually was. The answer, Nora could see from the woman's face as she read something on a tablet, was more serious than expected. Dark met her outside Barton's suite. Barton talked, Dark said, without preamble. His attorney advised against it, but he talked anyway. She said it without satisfaction, the way you report a fact when the fact is complicated. He's been carrying this for a while, longer than today. How long? 2 years. Dark moved her toward the conference room across the corridor. Smaller, no windows, a table with chairs that had seen too many difficult conversations to feel neutral. She closed the door. Price came to Barton 26 months ago with a proposal. There was a staffing restructuring in process. The hospital was absorbing a smaller clinic network, and the ER was being realigned. Price wanted control of nursing placements in his department. Control. Input that functioned as control. He framed it as clinical efficiency, wanting nurses who matched his workflow, who wouldn't generate friction, who would support the care model he'd established. Dark sat. Barton agreed because Price was the top revenue-generating physician in the department, and the absorption was complicated enough that he didn't want internal conflict. Nora sat across from her. The fluorescent light in the conference room was slightly too bright, the kind of light that makes everything look like evidence. So Price built his own roster, she said. He built an environment, Dark said. Nurses who fit stayed, nurses who questioned left, some voluntarily, some through exactly the kind of documentation campaign you experienced. The prior complaints against him came from 2 nurses who'd been in the department before the arrangement started. He'd targeted both of them within 6 months of taking placement input authority. She paused. Barton closed those complaints without review, because he'd already agreed to the arrangement. Because the moment he agreed to give Price that input, closing the complaints became self-protective. She folded her hands on the table. He didn't think of it as corruption. That's what he told the JAG officer. He thought of it as managing a difficult personality for the good of the institution. Nora recognized that logic. She'd seen it in other forms, in other contexts, the management of powerful people by the institutions that depended on them, the gradual normalization of whatever it cost. It wasn't unique to hospitals. It wasn't unique to anything. It was just what happened when protecting the system became indistinguishable from protecting the people who were abusing it. What about my placement? She said. Dark looked at her steadily. The staffing request Price submitted specified qualifications that, when you read them carefully, described your profile specifically. Military medical background, transitioning to civilian practice, no established local network, managed references. A pause. We believe he had access to a partially redacted version of your transitional file through someone in the placement chain, enough to identify your profile without the classified background detail. He knew I had military training. He knew you had a gap in your civilian record and a non-standard career path. He may have known the military component. He didn't know the operational specifics. Dark's jaw tightened slightly. The first physical tell she'd shown all day. He wanted someone who was competent enough to be useful and isolated enough to be managed. He thought a nurse with a non-standard history and no local connections would be, in his calculation, more compliant and more disposable. The room absorbed this. Nora sat with the specific feeling of understanding something that recontextualized a long stretch of time. Not shock. She'd moved past shock sometime around the consultation room that afternoon. Something quieter. The feeling of a shape completing, all its edges finally visible. He miscalculated, she said. Significantly. Something in Dark's expression shifted. Not warmth, still not warmth exactly, but something that acknowledged the specific irony without making a performance of it. The person he recruited to be a manageable placeholder turned out to be the person who kept his department from killing 2 patients in one morning and then documented his entire operation in the process. Nora thought about the 14 months. The night shifts, the write-ups. The way she'd learned to write everything down, not because she'd planned any of this, but because she'd understood, from very early on, that this was the kind of place where the paper trail was the only thing that outlasted the power structure. She thought about what it had cost. Not dramatically, not in ways she'd admitted out loud to anyone, but in the particular quiet attrition of spending a year being systematically underestimated by people who had constructed the underestimation as policy. "What happens now?" she said. "Tonight, Price's medical license is flagged for emergency review by the state board. The complaint he filed against you is suspended pending investigation of his own conduct. Standard procedure when the complainant is under active review." Dark opened a folder she'd brought in with her. "Tomorrow morning, Barton is formally interviewed under the oversight of the JAG office and a state health department investigator who is driving in tonight. The consolidated file on you, the one in Barton's office, is entered into evidence as documentation of a retaliatory administrative campaign. And Price. Price is currently unreachable by phone." She said it flatly. "His attorney has been in contact. Price will be interviewed tomorrow, with or without voluntary cooperation." The man in the parking garage footage. Being identified now, the footage went to the news through a channel we haven't fully traced yet. Someone in the building released it. She looked at Nora. "It wasn't us. We don't know who." Nora thought about the number of people who'd been in the building all day. Kayla, with her careful attention and her sharp memory. Ellis, who documented everything. Ballard, who'd been quietly asking questions about her background. The document specialist. Sayers, the dozen staff members who'd been in the bay, in the corridors at the station when things were happening. She thought about Greta, the 70-year-old woman in the examination room who nobody had sat with until Nora sat with her. Somebody had decided the public deserved to see the parking garage footage. She didn't know who. She thought privately that she understood the impulse. "There's one more thing," Dark said. Nora looked at her. "Hargrove wants to make a formal statement of commendation. On record, through Army Medical Command channels, citing your actions today." She paused. "It's his call to make, but it means your military service history becomes partially visible in the process. Some of it will move out of sealed status." The room was very still. Nora had spent 14 months, and the period before that, the transitional stretch that had brought her here, constructing a life that existed at a certain distance from what she'd been. Not because she was ashamed of it, because she'd needed to set it down and see what was left underneath, and the finding out had taken time, and the hospital had been part of that time. "Is that a question?" she said. "Or information?" "Information," Dark said. "The decision is his. I'm telling you so you're not surprised." Nora nodded. She looked at the table for a moment. The scarred surface of it, the ring left by a coffee cup someone had set down in this room during some other difficult conversation on some other difficult day. Hospitals accumulated those. Every piece of institutional furniture had a history of hard moments it had been present for. "Okay," she said, outschauen. She went home that night. Not immediately. There were 2 more hours of it first, a preliminary statement given to the JAG officer in the same conference room, her lawyer present by phone when she arrived, and in person 40 minutes later, a woman named Abby Ferrante who wore running shoes with her suit and asked very precise questions and wrote things down in a way that suggested she was already 3 moves ahead of the conversation. By the time Nora left the building, it was after 10. The parking structure was mostly empty. The night air had the quality of late-season cold, the kind with some teeth in it, and she stood beside her car for a moment before getting in and let it move through her. She drove home. She ate something from the refrigerator that she didn't particularly taste. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the opposite wall for a while, and then she lay down without taking her shoes off and slept for 7 hours without dreaming. Tip. The next 4 days moved in a way that was both fast and relentless, the way institutional accountability moves when it finally starts moving. Not elegantly, not cleanly, but with the accumulated force of everything that had been building pressure for a long time finding its release point all at once. Barton's formal interview took 3 hours. His cooperation was described by the JAG officer as thorough, which Ferrante told Nora meant he'd given them everything and was hoping cooperation would be reflected in whatever came next. The COO position was vacated, not immediately fired, which was a distinction that frustrated a lot of people, but placed on administrative leave pending board review, which in this case amounted to the same thing with more paperwork. The State Medical Licensing Board's emergency review of Price was initiated on the 2nd day. Nora was not present for it. She received updates through Ferrante, who relayed them in the same precise, non-performative language she used for everything. The prior complaints, the two nurses, the resident, all three of them contacted by investigators and all three of them willing to speak, were formally reopened and incorporated into the pattern of conduct assessment. On the third day, Price's hospital privileges were suspended pending the outcome of the licensing review. The suspension was immediate and complete. He could not practice at Wharton Regional or at any affiliated facility while the review was active. The news covered it, not in the breathless way that some stories get covered, but with the steady factual attention that the presence of military jurisdiction and a formal state investigation generated. There were two reporters who called the hospital. There was a brief statement from Army Medical Command confirming that a review was underway and that personnel had performed with distinction in the provision of care for a protected individual. The statement did not name Nora. Hargrove's commendation did. It went through official channels, which meant it was documented and formal and part of a record that would exist independently of whatever happened to any of the people involved. The commendation cited specific clinical decisions, specific timeframes, specific outcomes. It used her name. It cited her rank and service history, the portions that were no longer sealed, the portions that Hargrove had decided were relevant to the public record of what had happened in this building. Ferrante called her when it was filed. "You've seen it," Ferrante said. "I've seen it." "How are you?" Nora sat with the question for a moment. The actual question, not the social ritual version of it. How was she? She was tired. She was something adjacent to relieved, but not exactly relieved, because relief implied a return to a state that existed before. And she didn't think she was going back to before. She was clear, which was different from relieved. She was a person who knew what she was standing on. "I'm all right," she said, which was honest, if incomplete. "The removal order is formally expunged from your HR record as of this morning," Ferrante said. "The consolidated file that Price and Barton assembled has been entered into evidence and will not affect your professional standing in any way. You're clear." A pause. "Completely clear." Nora nodded at the phone, which was a pointless gesture. "Thank you, Abby." "You did the work," Ferrante said. "I just made sure it was visible." The board meeting happened on the fourth day. Nora wasn't invited to it. She wasn't a board member, wasn't administration, had no formal standing in the governance process. She found out what happened through Ellis, who found out through Bernadette, who had been called in as a witness, and came back to the floor afterward looking like someone who had set down something heavy and wasn't sure yet what her posture was without it. Price's contract was terminated, not suspended, not reviewed for further consideration. Terminated with documentation of cause that would follow his medical license application anywhere he tried to use it. The licensing board's preliminary findings, which had been shared with the hospital board prior to the meeting, outlined a pattern of conduct that made continued privilege untenable. The two nurses who'd filed prior complaints were formally notified that their complaints had been substantiated. One of them, who had left Wharton 18 months ago for a position at a smaller facility 2 counties over, called the hospital that afternoon and spoke to Ellis. He told Nora about it later, that she'd cried on the phone briefly before pulling herself together and saying she just needed to know someone had read it. Someone had read it. 3 additional administrative staff were placed under review. The structure of nursing placement authority in the ER was formally returned to the charge nursing team and the department head, independent of attending physician input. The policy change was written into the updated governance structure and required board-level authorization to modify. None of this was fast. None of it was clean. Institutions don't correct themselves with the satisfying snap of a verdict. They correct with the grinding, imperfect motion of large systems that move slowly and resist change and require more sustained pressure than any single day can generate. What happened at Wharton Regional was not a moment. It was 14 months of documentation, 2 patients caught in time, 1 day of convergence, and 4 days of subsequent process that built on all of it. Nora understood this. She'd been trained in environments where outcomes were measured in the gap between what should have happened and what actually did. And she had never expected perfection. She expected accountability. She had gotten it. Reese found her on the 5th day. Not at the hospital. Nora was on a scheduled day off, running her morning route through the neighborhood 3 blocks north of her apartment, the one with the older trees and the uneven sidewalk that required attention and therefore kept her present. She heard footsteps matching her pace and looked sideways, and there was Reese, in civilian clothes, running with the economy of someone whose fitness was maintained for function rather than aesthetics. They ran for a block before either of them said anything. "Hargrove's being transferred today," Reese said. "He asked me to tell you." "How is he?" "Annoyed that he can't walk faster, which means he's fine." A beat. "He wanted to come himself. Kessler told him the movement protocol was non-negotiable." "He should listen to Kessler." "He will. Eventually." Reese ran another half block. "He also said to tell you that the placement chain inquiry is complete. You'll receive the full report through official channels, but..." She paused. "The person who identified your profile for Price's staffing request was a mid-level administrator in the transitional placement office. He had access to records he shouldn't have had access to. He's been removed." She paused again. "He wasn't malicious. He was careless, and he was susceptible to the framing Price gave him, which was that he was looking for candidates with specialized backgrounds who needed a fresh start." The last phrase came out with a quality that communicated exactly what she thought of it. Nora kept running. The cold air was clean, and the trees were the specific bare branch shape of late season, and the sidewalk required her to watch where she was going, which was fine. "I'm not going back," she said, "to operations. I want that said plainly." "I know. Whatever Hargrove's commendation implies about ongoing utility or readiness, I'm not available for it." "Nora." Reese's voice had a quality she hadn't used before. Something without its professional coding, something that was just a person talking to another person. "Nobody's asking you to go back. Hargrove's commendation is about what you did. It's not a recruitment tool." She ran for a moment. "Although he does think you're wasted in a regional ER." "Tell him I know," Nora said. "I've been told." They ran to the end of the block and turned, and the city opened up slightly. A wider street, more light, the morning finding its full brightness through the break in the buildings. "What are you going to do?" Reese said. It was the question Nora had been sitting with for 5 days, in the spaces between the formal procedures and the statements and the updates from Ferrante and the 2 conversations she'd had with the interim department head about what the ER's restructuring would look like. It was a real question. It deserved a real answer. "There's a position," she said. "Emergency Response Training Coordinator. The hospital is creating it as part of the restructuring. They asked if I was interested." Reese glanced at her. "Training? Protocols, crisis response, interdepartmental communication under pressure." She kept her eyes on the sidewalk. "The stuff that failed here. Not the medicine, but the systems around the medicine. The reporting structures, the pressure on staff to stay quiet, the way authority gets used to override clinical judgment." She paused. "That's trainable. You can build better habits into institutions if you start early enough, and if somebody understands what the habits are supposed to accomplish." Reese was quiet for a moment. "You're going to stay." "I'm going to stay." Another block of running. The city around them continued its ordinary business. A dog walker, a delivery truck double parked, a woman opening the shutters on a small bakery with the focused ritual of someone who did this every morning and found something in the repetition that was worth finding. "For what it's worth," Reese said, "you're right that it's trainable. Most of what goes wrong in institutional medicine isn't competence failure, it's environment failure." She ran a few more strides. "And you've been building those environments, in worse conditions than this, for longer than you've been here." Nora didn't respond to that, but she didn't reject it either. They ran in silence for another 2 blocks, and then Reese peeled off at an intersection with a brief lift of her hand that communicated everything it needed to, and Nora ran the rest of her route alone. Chas. She was back at Wharton Regional on the 6th day. The ER was the ER. Full, loud in patches, quiet in others, running the perpetual metabolism of a place that processed human crisis without pause. The staff on the morning shift included Kayla, who saw Nora come through the door and said nothing but held eye contact for a moment with an expression that meant a great deal more than anything she could have put into words. Ellis, at the station, slid a coffee toward her without being asked. She took it. She stood at the nursing station for a moment and looked at the department. At the bays, the monitors, the equipment she'd moved through for 14 months. At the board with its current patient list and the particular organized chaos of an ER morning. At the people moving through it, imperfect, tired, some of them carrying more than they showed, doing work that mattered in a place that had been for a time made harder by the people who were supposed to maintain it. It was not fixed. Institutions don't fix. They change, gradually and imperfectly, under the sustained pressure of people who refuse to stop telling the truth. Price was gone, and Barton was gone, and the policy was changed, and the prior complaints were substantiated. But the work of making this a place where the right things could happen consistently. That was the longer project, the one that didn't have a final day. She was part of that project now, differently than before. Ballard came through the station on his way to Bay 2, saw her, stopped. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." He looked like he wanted to say something else. He was working up to it. She could see the calculation happening. The 29-year-old doctor trying to find the language for something he hadn't been trained to say. "I've been thinking about that morning," he said, "the intubation. And the thing you said to me afterward, that I did fine." He paused. "I've been thinking about what fine actually means, whether it's enough." She looked at him. At this young doctor who had, in the space of one morning, made the right call when it was easier to defer, admitted his own limitations, and then spent 5 days thinking about what the experience meant. That was the thing about medicine. It didn't give you the option of staying the same person you were before a hard case. You either learned or you didn't, and the learning showed in the patient in front of you next time. "Fine is a starting point," she said, "not a destination." He nodded. Something settled in him, not resolved, not completed, but repositioned into something he could work with. He went to Bay 2. She picked up the chart at the top of the stack. The patient in Bay 6 was a woman in her 50s presenting with chest pain and a dismissive attitude toward her own symptoms. The kind who apologized for being there, who said sorry when she coughed, who described pain she'd been living with for a week as probably nothing. Nora read the preliminary note from the triage nurse and went in and sat down next to the bed. Not across from it, next to it, and said, "Tell me what it actually feels like. Not the version you've decided is okay to mention. The real version." The woman looked at her. Something in her expression shifted. The specific relief of a person who has been given, unexpectedly, permission to be honest. "It's been," she started, and then she told her. Nora listened. She wrote things down. She asked 2 follow-up questions that changed the differential significantly and ordered a workup that 3 people later agreed had been the right call at the right time. She did this work because it was the work, not for commendations, not for the record, not for the investigation documentation, or the board meeting, or the formal vindication of her professional standing. She did it because a woman in Bay 6 was sitting with a pain she'd been minimizing for a week, and it mattered to get it right. That was the thing Price had never understood about her. The thing institutions sometimes fail to understand about the people who hold them up from underneath. The quiet ones, the documenters, the nurses who stay in the room when everyone else has left. The work wasn't performed for an audience. The work was what they were. Take the audience away. Add hostility. Remove recognition entirely. The work continued because it wasn't contingent on being seen. But being seen, when it finally came, mattered too. Not for the ego, for the record, for the proof that the work had happened, that the patients had been protected, that the quiet person in the corner had been right all along, and the institution had been wrong to silence her. The record now existed. She was still standing in it. But some things that are true about power and the people who abuse it, they depend on silence. They are calibrated, precisely, deliberately, to the threshold of what people will endure without speaking. And when they miscalculate that threshold, when they select the wrong person to push past the point of endurance, the entire structure they've built on silence becomes evidence. 14 months of being told she didn't belong had produced 14 months of documentation. 14 months of being dismissed had produced 14 months of catches. Patients flagged, orders questioned, errors caught by the one person in the room that everyone had agreed, without discussing it, to stop listening to. And one morning, one ordinary Tuesday morning in an ER in Delwood, the silence ended and the documentation became the case, and the person they'd spent 14 months trying to erase became the clearest voice in the room. She had not fought to be recognized. She had worked. She had written things down. She had stayed in the room when they tried to remove her from it. She had cared about the patients even when caring was the thing that made her a target. The lesson was not that virtue is always rewarded. It isn't, not always, not reliably, not on any timeline that feels humane. The lesson was that the work is the only thing you can actually control. The documentation, the precision, the refusal to let what you know be overwritten by what someone more powerful insists is true. That's what you carry into every room you're told you don't belong in. It doesn't guarantee recognition, but it makes recognition possible, and it makes you the kind of person who can receive it when it comes without losing what you were before it arrived. Nora Voss stood in the emergency room of Wharton Regional Medical Center on the 6th morning after the longest Tuesday of her professional life and picked up a chart and went to work. She was, as she had always been, exactly where she was supposed to be.